The Master and Margarita is a masterpiece of Russian literature, written by Mikhail Bulgakov and published posthumously in 1966-67. This novel remains a captivating story for hearts and minds of readers all over the world, even though almost a century has passed since the events described by Bulgakov took place. This mystical novel, which had been worked on for a total of 12 years, is a unique blend of characters and places scattered all around Moscow, many of which existed in real life or else still do exist. However, we always have to keep in mind that The Master and Margarita is not only a novel about two lovers or a brilliant satire of the Soviet way of life in the 1920s and 30s, but it is also a novel that captures such topics as religion, history, mystery. It is a uniquely profound work. Today I'm inviting you to get to know The Master and Margarita and its author better, to look closer at the language of the novel, so to speak, and of course get acquainted with all the theories that have been circulating around the novel. It doesn't matter if you're just into reading or else you are learning Russian, for example, and are trying to get to know its culture better through Russian literature, or even neither of those. You are very welcome to my channel and hope you'll enjoy this little adventure of ours along the pages of The Master and Margarita. There are a lot of places we have to visit today, a lot of theories to look at, so follow me, reader. Our first stop is going to be at the Patriarch's Ponds in downtown Moscow. In this part of the video, I'll take you through many places that were featured in the novel by Bulgakov. And I think the best way to do it is to do it in its order, as the story follows. We'll be talking about the plot in detail. Don't be afraid though of spoilers if you haven't read the book yet. There will be so many things I've left personally for you to read and see by yourself. And at the same time, we'll be doing some stops at certain places which we have to discuss and secrets of which we have to reveal. That's why we have come here now, Patriarch's Ponds, the starting point of the story. At the sunset hour of one warm spring day, two men were to be seen at Patriarch's Ponds. The first was none other than Mikhail Alexandrovich Berlioz, editor of a highbrow literary magazine and chairman of the management committee of one of the biggest Moscow literary clubs, known by its abbreviation as Massalib. His young companion was the poet Ivan Nikolaevich Ponorev, who wrote under pseudonym of Bezdomny, which in translation from Russian means homeless. The two men start a curious conversation about Jesus Christ, about whom Ivan was commissioned to write an anti-religious poem. Berlioz, in his turn, explains the major error that Bezdomny made. His Jesus Christ came out to be too much alive. That is, he had to make his poem seem so that Christ had actually never existed. We should really pay attention to this conversation taking place in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, the time when the country was under the strongest influence of atheism, the time when there was a massive organized atheist movement. The leading anti-religious organization in the USSR was the so-called League of Militant Atheists. The atheist newspaper, Bezbozhnik, the Godless One, published since 1922, played a major role in its emergence. The Soviet government considered the church to be a brake on socialist construction and the Cultural Revolution, The party set the task of ideological fight against religion in all its aspects, the formation of a scientific worldview among workers, the promotion of natural science and atheistic knowledge. So the topic of conversation between Berlioz and Bezdomny was nothing out of the ordinary in that period of time. However, it got attention from one stranger who happened to take a stroll at the same time and at the same place that day. Not only a stranger, but a foreigner for sure, as Berlioz and Ivan think immediately. His appearance and behavior is far from the one of a Soviet man, plus the foreigner speaks with a foreign accent, although in correct Russian. Another thing that deserves our attention here is the image, so to speak, of foreigners in the Soviet Union, especially during the years we're talking about, since everything related to abroad, everything related to foreign, aroused in the Soviet citizens not only a great interest. The country was closed. It was insanely hard to be able to go traveling abroad. By the way, Bulgakov himself was eventually never let to go out abroad. But along with that, also a fear and distrust, let's say, which is actually something natural due to the so rare contact with everything foreign. When you see somebody from abroad, you are of course going to be curious on one hand, and on the other suspicious and distrustful. Note even the name of this chapter, Never Talk to Strangers. That's why Ivan Bezdomny is going to call later their interlocutor a spy and try to convince the police that they will need several machine guns to catch him and his gang. So, although unwillingly, the man let the stranger join their interesting conversation revolving around the proof of non-existence of Jesus Christ, to which the stranger reacts with the utmost surprise, asking the friends several times if they really do think so. In our country, there's nothing surprising about atheism, said Berlioz with diplomatic politeness. Most of us have long ago and quite consciously given up believing all those fairy tales about God. The visitor from abroad then thoughtfully reminds them about the 5 proofs of the existence of God, the ones that were made by Thomas Aquinas, but even they don't convince the friends, nor the 6th proof made by Kant, also mentioned here, with whom the strange foreigner claims to have had breakfast once. This is the moment when Berlioz and Bezdomny begin to suspect something is wrong. The conversation gains momentum and gets more profound with the stranger saying, "If there is no God, then who, one wonders, rules the life of man and keeps the world in order?" To which Berlioz angrily answers, "Man rules himself." The answer seems rather stupid, since how can a man control his own affairs if he doesn't know what will happen to him tomorrow? Well, in the case of Berlioz, he can't even predict what he'll be doing tonight. The meeting he is organizing, according to the foreigner, will not take place. Moreover, the strange visitor from abroad gives a horrifying prophecy. Berlioz will be killed because of one Russian woman. His head will be cut off. And in order to prove his words about Berlioz's not assisting to the meeting, the stranger assures his rightness by the fact that Annushka has already bought the sunflower seed oil. In fact, she has not only bought it, but has already spilled it. So the meeting will not take place. And as for Ivan Nikolaevich, the visitor mentions something about schizophrenia, which eventually will play rather a cruel joke on him. Now, I totally understand the conversation is truly intriguing, but let's leave it for a couple of minutes and let me tell you more about the visitor himself, and who that Annushka, who that strange woman was. Actually, the woman really existed, and which is more interesting, Bulgakov not only knew her, but lived with her in the same block of flats, in the so-called communal apartment, which were really popular in the Soviet Union and which in colloquial Russian speech, which is called kommunalka. It is a house where you have one room on your own and you have to share kitchen and bathroom with your neighbors. This is the exact yard and the exact kommunalka where Bulgakov lived during his first years in Moscow, and which is now, as you can see, a museum. I will show you the inside a bit later and tell you more about the flat he lived in. So that woman, Annushka, or just Anne as it is sometimes written in the English translation of the novel, was a real character, was a real person. On one page of Bulgakov's diary, we can see this entry dated October 1923, dedicated specially to her. The day they floated for the first time, I spent the whole evening covering up the windows. The first flooding was marked by the fact that the famous Annushka left the kitchen window wide open for the night. I positively do not know what to do with the bastard who inhabits this apartment. The hatred towards that woman, towards that Annushka, Bulgakov would carry throughout his whole life, the prototype of whom would appear in several works of the author. And by the way, the phrase itself, even though in its shortened form, Annushka has already spilled the sunflower seed oil, has now turned into a popular expression, and I can guarantee you that everybody in Russia knows, and I would even say uses it pretty much often, to show that we cannot escape fate, that nothing can already be done, but it is used, of course, in a humorous way, in ironic context. So if you're learning Russian, take note of this phrase. Annushka уже разлила масло, which will definitely help you to surprise natives. I think it's high time for us finally to get to know the strange foreigner better. Who was it? What was his name? Why has he even come to Moscow in the first place? Well, let me tell you now. Let's start with the name, although for the first time we will see it only in chapter 7, A Bad Apartment. The name of this strange visitor is Woland, beginning with the Latin letter W. Berlioz and Bezdomny see this letter when they ask to show them his documents. Who knows if he really would have turned out to be a foreign spy? And there they read, Professor. During the conversation, it turns out that Woland, a specialist in black magic, was invited to Moscow since the original manuscripts of the 10th century prologue were found in the State Library. Woland was invited to sort them out because, according to him, he is the only specialist in the world. By the way, did this warlock really exist? Yes, this is a historical figure, a medieval scientist and church figure, Pope from 1999 to 1003, Sylvester II, was suspected in practicing magic, whose figure became one of the prototypes of the legend about Dr. Faust. Sylvester II, as the legend tells, summoned the devil. That one made him a pope and always accompanied him in the form of a black, shaggy dog. Mentioning Faust, we cannot fail to mention how closely related the Master and Margarita by Bulgakov and Faust by Goethe are, which was written based on the German legend about Dr. Faust, who sold his soul to the devil. As far as is known, Bulgakov himself was an admirer of Goethe and his Faust, from which he took enough references to the Master and Margarita. First of all, let's look at the very beginning of the novel. The epigraph quotes lines from Faust. Secondly, Woland got his name from Goethe's Mephistopheles, which is heard once in the poem. And the fact that Woland says he is German suggests another proof he is related to Goethe's work. Moreover, the name of Margarita, who we'll soon talk about, is taken almost for sure from Faust too. Margarita, the name of Faust's beloved. Let's also pay attention to the poodle. Under his arm he carried a walking stick with a knob in the shape of a poodle's head. This is how Woland is described when he first appears on the Patriarch's pawns, and it was the form of a black poodle that Mephistopheles took in order not to reveal his true appearance, and it was in this form that he first entered Faust's cell. Believe me, references to Goethe's Faust do not end here, but I'd rather leave them to you so that you can track down some similarities when reading yourself, or else after you get this mini magazine I've created myself. I've been preparing for filming this video actually for about a year now, read literally thousands of pages, and even though I would love to, but it's impossible for me to put everything into this one little video. So I decided to give you other secrets and more information on Bulgakov and his Master and Margarita in this magazine. Such themed handmade journals are also available on my shop right now. Do have a look at them and get one for yourself. All the links are down below the video. In fairness, it should be noted that Bulgakov did not accidentally borrow, let's call it so, some sketches from Goethe's Faust. Firstly, Goethe was far from the first one to write about Faust, a character from the German legend, the topic of which had been very popular in Europe, perhaps since the 16th century. Importantly, German culture has been linked to and influenced Russian culture for a long time. Literature, science, education. In general, there were many historical interactions between Germany and Russia, including philosophical and literary ones. There are too many Germans in Russian literature depicted in the works starting from Chekhov and ending with Tolstoy. I think this was worth mentioning too. Well, it's time to return to the Patriarch's pawns, although not for long. Our heroes still continue their fascinating dialogue about the non-existence of Jesus, which, according to Woland, has no place to be. He existed, that's all there is to it. There's no need for any proof. Knowing the place where everything happened, we readers, I guess, would also like to know the date, well, at least the year of when the professor conducts such an intriguing conversation with Berlioz and Bezdomny. And I'll tell you what, some researchers have managed to find out even the exact date of when their conversation has taken place. And here, by the way, Woland himself helps us with that when he begins his own story and when the action of the novel moves smoothly to Jerusalem. The 14th of the spring month of Nisan is the day on which the Jewish Easter, Passover, is celebrated. The date celebrates the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. Meanwhile, as one Russian philologist explains, the part of Moscow affairs takes place during the period called Holy Week. I'll run a little ahead and say that the action of the novel itself lasts a little more than just 3 days, from sunset on Wednesday in May to the night from Saturday to Sunday, which is the day of Orthodox Easter. The researchers managed to calculate that in the period from 1917 to 1940, the latest Easter fell on May 5th, 1929. Therefore, in some circles of literary researchers, it is considered to be this date, May 1st, Wednesday, 1929, when Moscow received Professor Woland on a visit, although this is often argued. This also suggests one theory that the events taking place in Jerusalem are matched to the events taking place in Moscow. Moscow and Jerusalem, this is the central parallel of the novel. What do they have in common? Going forward again, cowardice is one of the worst sins, will be mentioned by Yeshua. Cowardice, and with that fear too, will be running both plots. We will see parallels between the Master and Yeshua, between Baron Maigel and Judas, for example. So what happened the 14th of the spring month of Nisan? We see that the action of the novel smoothly moves from Moscow in the first chapter to Ershalaim, another transliteration of Jerusalem. This is how it is written in the original, which we see in the second chapter called Pontius Pilate. Again, I'm saying this to you in Russian, how it is written in original, because I'm afraid to make any pronunciation mistakes. So, Pontius Pilate. The whole story is told by Woland in order to convince the friends sitting at the Patriarch's bones of the existence of Jesus. So, to Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator of Judea, a central character in the subplot, suffering from a painful migraine, loving only one being in the world, his big dog named Banga, sitting in a white cloak lined with blood red. They bring an arrested man named Yeshua Ha-Notsri, a crazy philosopher accused of inciting the destruction of the Jerusalem's temple. The conversation of Pilate with Yeshua is so interesting that you can literally quote and pass every line. But in order to save your time, I will draw your attention only to the most important, in my opinion, quotes. So Yeshua denies the accusation of wanting to destroy the temple, saying, "I spoke, hegemon, on how the temple of the old beliefs would fall down and the new temple of truth would be built up." To which Pontius Pilate responds with a well-known question: what is truth? This scene immediately reminds me personally of this painting, What is Truth? Christ and Pilate, made by Nikolai Gier in 1890. Some readers and researchers of Bulgakov's work seriously believe that the image of Yeshua and the scene from the second chapter were inspired by this very painting. Yeshua also claims that he is constantly followed by one man, Levi Matvey. This man follows me everywhere, with nothing but his goatskin parchment, and writes incessantly. But I once caught a glimpse of that parchment, and I was horrified. I had not said a word of what was written there. I begged him, "Please burn this parchment of yours," but he tore it out of my hands and ran away. These good people are unlearned and have confused everything I said. I am beginning to fear that this confusion will last for a very long time, and all because he untruthfully wrote down what I said. Please let me draw your attention here to another parallel between Moscow and Jerusalem. Yeshua wanting to burn down the manuscripts that are written by Levi Matvey because they seem to him untrustworthy, they are literally wrong, while the Master in Moscow wants to do the same, but only in his case he does achieve it. His manuscripts of the novel he writes are burned down by him. For 1 second, Yeshua's fate is decided. Pilate does not find him guilty, but only crazy, until he is informed that Yeshua is accused of saying unflattering things about the great Caesar. Judas appears in the story of Yeshua, and it turns out he invited Ha-Notsri to visit his home and was interested in Ha-Notsri's views on state power. All power is a form of violence exercised over people, and that the time will come when there will be no rule by Caesar, nor any other form of rule. Men will pass into the kingdom of truth and justice, where no sort of power will be needed. That was his answer. Pontius Pilate then starts to scream after hearing that.
На свете не было, нет и не будет никогда более великой и прекрасной для людей власти, чем власть императора Тиверия. И не тебе, безумный преступник, рассуждать о ней.
In these words, we can trace cowardice of Pilate in front of the authorities and his desire to be heard by everyone, even by those who are presented there. They are next to him, but are unnoticed or probably even hidden. His main aim is to show his loyalty to Caesar, his devotion to him. He screams so much that he even breaks his voice. He's so scared of Caesar. So the result of the meeting, Ha-Notsri is, after all, sentenced to death, although when talking to the high priest of Judea, Caiaphas, Pilate hopes deep in his heart that it will be Yeshua who will be chosen for salvation in honor of the upcoming holiday Passover. Caiaphas chooses another criminal to save, though. This representative of the higher clergy is portrayed very negatively by Bulgakov. We can see it, obviously. Portrayed as an ordinary, cold-blooded and cunning politician. Ha-Notsri will be, anyways, executed, along with other two real criminals. It was over, and there was no more to be discussed. Ha-Notsri had gone forever, and there was no one to heal the procurator's terrible, savage pains. There was no cure for them now except death. But this thought did not strike Pilate immediately. At first, his whole being was seized with the same incomprehensible sense of grief which had come to him on the balcony. He at once sought for its explanation, and its cause was a strange one. The procurator was obscurely aware that he still had something to say to the prisoner, and that perhaps, too, he had more to learn from him. No doubt, every reader will notice the line drawn between Jesus and Yeshua in the Master and Margarita. Bulgakov was generally very familiar to the topic of religion, Bible, Gospels, including apocryphal Gospels. Both of his grandfathers were priests. His father taught in a theological seminary. Bulgakov was expected to continue this path. Speaking of the scenes with Pontius Pilate, it is also necessary to mention the Gospel of Nicodemus, which describes Pilate's unwillingness to judge Jesus and actually his will to leave him alive. This is from where the author could have taken some inspiration from. And here the question may arise, is Yeshua depicted as Jesus? Well, nobody, unfortunately or not, can tell us for sure except for Bulgakov himself. However, some scholars claim that Ha-Notsri in no way could be even compared to Jesus Christ in this novel. How do they explain this? Well, Jesus Christ is a God-man. He is first of all divine, and while Ha-Notsri is a man-god, he is first of all human. We can only wonder what was the author's purpose. To show Jesus from the human side, to humanize him, or else to show absolutely another person deliberately. Write your opinion, by the way, down in the comments. It will be very interesting to look at it and discuss with others. So this is the story that Professor Woland came up with, for which Berlioz and Bezdomny did not notice how it began to get dark. The story is interesting, but it just does not seem very true to the friends, to which Woland presents an irrefutable proof. He was there himself, saw and heard that conversation. Perhaps this was the last straw for Berlioz and Ivan. The professor sitting with them was clearly not himself and was just talking nonsense. And here he asks a serious question.
А дьявола тоже нет?
И дьявола? Тише ты, тише. Ну нет никакого дьявола.
Да это ж положительно. Интересно, что же это у вас? Чего не хочется? Ничего нет.
The plan of Berlioz was to run to the nearest telephone box and tell the Bureau of Foreigners that there is a foreign professor sitting at Patriarch's pawns who is clearly insane. Something had to be done, or there might be a nasty scene. It has to be done quietly and calmly, so as not to disturb the mentally ill. Berlioz decides to quickly escape. He rushed towards the park gates at the corner of Bronnaya and Yermolaevsky streets. Berlioz ran on. At the park gates leading into Bronnaya Street, the identical man whom a short while ago the editor had seen materialize out of a mirage got up from a bench and walked toward him. But Berlioz had no time to speak or to be surprised at anything else, just to cross the road. But suddenly a tram appears. Berlioz steps back and slips, falling directly onto the tram tracks. As it turns out later, Berlioz slipped on sunflower oil, which was recently spilled by Annushka. Berlioz vanished from sight under the tram car. A dark object rolled across the cobbles over the curbstone and bounced along the pavement. It was a severed head. As you can see, trams do not run on Patriarch's pawns today, but this place is still associated with the first chapters of the Master and Margarita. Chapter 3, The Seventh Proof, also features a scene when Woland says to Berlioz as a farewell, "But please, as a farewell request, at least say you believe in the devil. I won't ask anything more of you. Don't forget that there's still the seventh proof, the soundest, and it's just about to be demonstrated to you." The seventh proof of what? Well, just a couple of minutes before we mentioned the proofs about God's existence, about which all the three were arguing, and here is the seventh proof. The devil's prophecy, well, one of them, comes true. Berlioz dies just as he was told. Therefore, the existence of the devil is proved, which in turn proves the existence of God. And all this, let's remember, happened just in one evening. Who, under such horrifying circumstances and such a shock, won't go crazy? So Ivan finds himself in such an unenviable situation. He had naturally forgotten all about the mad German and could do nothing but wonder how 1 minute he could have been talking to Berlioz and the next his head. The young poet suddenly begins to think restlessly. All the words mix up in his head. Annushka, Pontius Pilate, the sunflower seed oil. And finally, he decides to take action, to catch the murderer and the spy. Unfortunately, it's impossible to do. Woland is joined by his two assistants, Regent in his checkered jacket, also named choir master, and also the famous huge black cat named Behemoth. Ivan's pursuit of this gang begins. So he runs through half of Moscow, reaches the embankment of the Moskva river, and decides for no reason to wash himself in its waters. His clothes are stolen, and that's how he, wearing almost nothing but his underwear, with a candle and an old paper icon, resorts to Griboyedov house. The house now belonged to Massalit, headed by the unfortunate Mikhail Alexandrovich Berlioz. What else needs to be added is that here, and indeed throughout the whole novel, we will see a connection with the Bible, well, in this case with Holy Week. Let's look at how Ivan unexpectedly and for no obvious reason decides to swim in the waters of the Moskva river, which was supposed to happen on Thursday night. Do you catch any connection with Holy Thursday, which commemorates the washing of the feet and the Last Supper of Jesus Christ? This day, Holy Thursday, is, by the way, in Russian, usually called Clean Thursday. And so every day of Holy Week will appear before us in the novel. I told you more about this in the magazine. But still, let's not forget that Moscow has fallen under the influence of Satan this Holy Week. Therefore, the events that take place now may look specific and rather strange. In short, what happens next? Everybody finds out Berlioz is dead. Of course, no one believes Bezdomny. He is sent to a mental hospital where he is diagnosed with, guess what? Schizophrenia. Woland and his retinue settle in the apartment of Berlioz. Thereby, 2 more predictions of Woland come true. How did Woland manage to live in Berlioz's apartment? Well, being invited to Moscow on such an occasion, he had to settle somewhere, so he chooses exactly this address. Sadovaya 302 bis, apartment number 50, the real prototype of the writer's home. Now we return back to this communal apartment which Bulgakov lived in from 1921 to 1924. Bulgakov lived here with his first wife and, well, other people, among whom was Annushka. We have already talked about her today. This apartment has forever remained for Bulgakov the embodiment of evil, so to speak. He spent some of the most terrible years right here in an apartment that now has the name of Bad Apartment. To be completely honest with you, when I entered this place and was going up the stairs, as the flat is on the 4th floor, it really gave me creeps, I have to tell you. Nowadays, all the walls of the entrance are painted in sketches and quotes from the Master and Margarita by its fans. There's a cafe inside the theater museum of Bulgakov which gave me more creeps when I saw this. Trust me, the cat is just huge. It is literally Behemoth. We'll talk about him in 2 minutes. Having a coffee next to such a beast was, well, quite an experience. There were moments when it gave me the impression it would right now stand and talk to me, just like in the book. It must be said that Bulgakologists claim that Woland and his assistants did not actually settle here. The place is rather small and poor, and the apartment they occupied could actually be another one, but from the same house from the same yard. So Woland chooses for himself the apartment which was rented by now already deceased Berlioz and his companion Stepan Likhadeev, the director of the Marietta Theatre. Likhadeev's fate, by the way, is not so much better than Berlioz's. This apartment, by the way, even before the evil spirits settled down there, did not have a good reputation. People simply used to disappear from it. How could this be possible? Well, in fact, here Bulgakov draws a line with the Soviet realities of those years when apartments were searched, of which the writer himself became a victim, and also arrests. People would leave their homes accompanied by police or else just alone, and sometimes would never come back. Well, and after the events happened in this apartment, while and after being occupied by Woland and his gang, the nickname Bad Apartment really got stuck to it. Now let's take a closer look at Woland's entourage itself. There is something to discuss and something to say. Woland's favorite buffoon, Behemoth, may present himself in front of us in the form of a black cat as huge as a hog, walking on its hind legs, but it can also act as a short man in a torn cap with a cat's face. However, in the majority of episodes, Behemoth acts in his feline nature, making people go crazy on seeing him behaving like a human being. Behemoth combines many traits that catch your attention: his love for philosophizing, his humorous remarks and habits, his aggressiveness after all. Behemoth's activity is the reason why, after the disappearance of Woland and his retinue, black cats are being caught and exterminated all over the country. According to the text of the novel, about 100 of them were later caught. Behemoth in Christian mythology is a negatively colored spiritual being, a demon of carnal desires, especially gluttony, is a beast from the biblical book of Job and is a form of the primeval chaos monster created by God at the beginning of creation. Koroviev, or else Fagot in the original, is another member of Woland's retinue. Presents himself either as a former regent or as a translator for a noble foreigner who always appears in his checkered trousers and jacket and his pince-nez. Koroviev appears already in the first paragraphs of the novel, where he first seems like a hallucination visible only to Berlioz. The role of Koroviev is mainly associated with dirty work and tricks. His real name, Fagot, meaning in Russian a bassoon, is probably derived from the name of the musical instrument of the same name, invented by the Italian monk Afranio. Due to this circumstance, the connection between Koroviev, Fagot, and Afranius, the head of the secret guard under the procurator Pontius Pilate, is sharply marked. And Azazello, the third member of the group whose main function in the novel is violence. The name Azazello goes back to the character of the Book of Enoch, an ancient Hebrew apocalyptic religious text. In Jewish legends, Azazel is a fallen angel. With the appearance of such evil spirits, it goes without saying that the city, at least for a while, will not be the same. So in Moscow, strange things begin to happen that are completely inexplicable. Let's start with the bed apartment, which we have already mentioned, the very one in which Woland and his entourage have settled. What's going on inside there? In chapter 9, we get to know Nikanor Ivanovich Bosoy, the chairman of the house committee at the address where the late Berlioz lived. Why does he appear in the apartment? The fact is that in this chapter Bulgakov shows another feature, so to speak, of the Soviet era, the famous housing issue, or as we call it, квартирный вопрос. In general, the issue of housing in those years was difficult. You already know about the communal apartments. The same question haunted Bulgakov, by the way, for a long time. Because of this, the writer even imbued with hatred for communal service workers. In the 20s and 30s, it was believed that the tenants of each block of flats manage it themselves. In the novel, it is exactly Bosoy who comes to the apartment, both tenants of which are absent. The news of Berlioz's death spread through the building with supernatural speed, and from 7 o'clock on Thursday morning, Bosoy started to get telephone calls. After that, people began calling in person with written pleas of their urgent need of vacant housing space. Within the space of 2 hours, Nikanor Ivanovich had collected 32 such statements. That's why he comes to the apartment, where he is met by a man in a plaid jacket, Koroviev, interpreter to a foreign gentleman residing in this flat, behaving extremely cheaply, we must note. According to him, Woland, invited to Moscow on his own whim, wished to stay in this exact apartment. Koroviev also hints to the chairman of the housing association that the guest is a millionaire. That is, he can ask a lot for temporary residence in this apartment. He will give any money. So Bosoy receives 5,000 rubles, a huge amount of money for that time, for a week of living here, and even gets a couple of free tickets to the show of the foreign consultant for himself and his wife. Woland does not like this rascal, so Koroviev at the same moment reacts.
Алло, считай своим долгом сообщить, что наш председатель жилтоварищества, номер 3302 БИС по Садовой, Никодор Иванович Боsoy, спекулирует валютой. Да, в данный момент в его квартире, в вентиляции, в уборной, в газете, в бумаге $400. Да, кто говорит? Говорит жилец означенного дома.
Upon arrival home, Nikanor Ivanovich does exactly as described by the translator in a checkered jacket. And just a few minutes later, he's arrested for storing currency, which he neatly packed into newspaper sheets and hid it in a place where, as he thought, no one would have thought of getting into. This scene also requires some decoding, I think, especially for those readers who are not very familiar with the way of life in Soviet Union during the years of 1920s and 30s. The thing is that in Soviet Russia, currency storage was equated to state crimes. Sometimes it was simply impossible to buy or exchange currency. People would get imprisoned for illegal sale of currency, with the exceptions of citizens who received approval from the state to go abroad. But what does the currency have to do with it if Bosoy receives his native rubles? The thing is that these rubles have somehow magically turned into dollars, at the sight of which Nikanor Ivanovich is speechless.
Так, доллары вентиляции.
Ваш пакетик?
Подбросили враги.
Это бывает.
Bosoy is taken away by the police in an unknown direction and then ends up in a psychiatric hospital. In the meantime, we will move to one of the most interesting parts of the novel, which describes the black magic sessions of the foreign artist Woland at the Varieté Theatre. As you may have noticed, many places featured in the novel really do exist in Moscow, but this unfortunately has nothing to do with Varieté, which actually has never existed. There was no theatre with that name in Moscow, although some believe that Bulgakov could have meant the current theatre of satire. The episode begins with the appearance on stage of the famous Moscow Master of Ceremonies, George Bengalsky. His flat jokes, witty in his opinion, phrases disgust Woland. Koroviev takes matters into his own hands, and Behemoth simply takes Bengalsky's head off, doing it with pleasure, terrifying the audience, that at the same time becomes charmed with the first trick. White pieces of paper begin to fall from the ceiling that even had a special smell. It was freshly printed money. At the very beginning, Woland utters a phrase that is in fact the key to understanding the entire episode, as well as determining the reason for Woland's appearance in Moscow. Tell me, my dear fagot, do you find the people of Moscow much changed? The entertainer Bengalsky finally gets his head back, but unfortunately becomes violent, starts crying, muttering something. Anyway, he is picked up by an ambulance and ends up in the same psychiatric hospital. Meanwhile, Woland turns the Varieté Hall into a laboratory for the study of human weaknesses. Each trick reveals to himself and to us readers the essence of people and their dark sides. Greed, envy. Here is a scene with dresses and shoes from Paris which then simply disappear. Cruelty, a proposal for beheading the Master of Ceremonies, by the way, comes from the audience, and there's only one woman who took pity on him. After some time of observing people, Woland sums it up. "Well, now," replied the magician reflectively, "they're people like any others. They're over fond of money, but then they always were. Humankind loves money, no matter if it's made of leather, paper, bronze, or gold. They're thoughtless, of course, but then they sometimes feel compassion too. They're ordinary people. In fact, they remind me very much of their predecessors, except that the housing issue has sought them." As I've already mentioned, this chapter describing the show, as they will later call, of hypnosis, is very important. Bulgakov, with Woland's thoughts and words, again draws the line between two sides of the novel, Moscow and Jerusalem, showing that people have not changed at all. They still love money. They are frivolous, sometimes cruel, sometimes merciful. This was the case in the time of Christ and in the time of Bulgakov. And now, people don't change. Speaking of hypnosis, by the way, it will be interesting to mention one person, this one, who was famous just in the 30s, a Russian artist who specialized in the, as they call it, mental magic and hypnosis sessions, which, by the way, were really popular in the Soviet Union at that time. Friends, we have been discussing the Master and Margarita for quite a while, but have you noticed we have not yet mentioned the Master itself? nor Margarita. Well, now we come to the chapter 13, Enter the Hero, the events of which occur in Dr. Stravinsky Hospital. Inside here, there are already several characters from the novel, each of whom, one way or another, on their own experiences, was convinced of what it means to deal with evil spirits. Someone's hidden rubles turn into dollars, someone's head disappears and reappears again, and someone has actually a real contact face to face to those evil spirits, conducts a dialogue with them, and even sees a friend die in front of him. The latter, as we already know, the poet Ivan Bezdomny, who, after very long persuasions, is finally calmed down and escaped in Stravinsky's clinic. And it is to him that the master makes his way, and who was, as it turns out, the same hospital, for the same reason. The reason is Pontius Pilate. The conversation between Ivan and the master, this way he introduces himself. He had long ago, according to him, abandoned his name, and now he's simply the master. The conversation is extremely important. Again, we can analyze almost every line. At the request of the master, Ivan tells him in detail about his meeting with Woland, and he listens very carefully, exclaiming at the end, "At Patriarch's pawns yesterday you met Satan." Now let's make a little stop here and say that the connection between the master and Satan here is almost obvious. The master knows something and seems to be very well acquainted with the identity of the person who Bezdomny was dealing with. He claims that everything Woland told him had actually happened, because as it turns out, he himself, a year earlier, wrote a novel about Pontius Pilate. Here comes the time for another theory. For some, it might even look like the revelation of the novel's secret, so pay attention to this. As some scholars claim, a lot says about the fact that the master wasn't really the main creator of his novel. Firstly, he does not have his own personal name. Master is a replacement for his true name, which he renounced. In the course of Bulgakov's narrative, the master dissolves into the novel he wrote and into his dependence on Woland. He doesn't need a name anymore. The only reason, the only thing that keeps him alive now is his novel, Satanic Gospel, as certain researchers argue. Moreover, there's an obvious play with letters. W, the first letter in Woland, is an upside-down letter of M, the first letter in Master. Secondly, the story of Pilate begins before the appearance of the master in the novel. Remember, we began talking about the master only in chapter 13. Who starts and who finishes the novel about Pontius Pilate? Woland. However, Woland is in no hurry to announce his involvement in writing it. But the devil is, first of all, is a liar and an illusion in everything. So Woland's lies throughout the novel should not surprise us in any way. Moreover, the fact that the epigraph of Bulgakov's novel refers specifically and only to Woland shows in whom the author sees his main character. Woland says he comes to Moscow to get acquainted with the manuscript of one of Faust's, but in reality he might mean the master. So this is why it is often put this way. Woland is Bulgakov's Mephistopheles. The master is Bulgakov's Faust. As one Russian theologian and philosopher once wrote, the master's relationship with Woland is the classic relationship of a human creator with a demon. A person gives his talent to the spirit, and in turn he receives something back: information, visions, energy, strength, if necessary, and protection from enemies. Sometimes the person himself doesn't even realize from where that inspiration comes from. The master, for example, having already completed his novel, sees Woland for the first time. Woland, however, pretends he has nothing to do with that novel. Why does Woland have to choose the master to write the novel? Why can't he do it himself? Well, what Satan doesn't have is his own creative talent, what the master obviously should have. The novel about Pontius Pilate, as predicted by Margarita, could have incredible success. She and the master are absorbed together by it. That's just here when, for the first time, the image of Margarita appears. It is the work with which the master came out to the world of literature for the first time, but which later he remembers with horror. He tells Ivan about the terrible moments in his life he had to go through when he would get negative reviews in newspapers from literary critics. The appalling failure of my novel seemed to have withered part of my soul, declares the master. That's how he begins to be afraid of the dark, and here comes the stage of his mental derangement. The novel will be somehow saved by Margarita, who comes to the master's basement at the moment of its almost inevitable death. Margarita decides to take an important step, to tell her husband she has a lover and leave him for the master. So she leaves him, promising to return already forever in the morning. However, this was the last meeting of the master with his love, because after Margaret leaves, we read that someone knocks on the window. The same night, the master decides to come himself to the hospital of Dr. Stravinsky, who is already known to us. So the master has been here for treatment for 4 months now. Let's look at the image of the master in detail now. Of course, no matter what anybody says, this image does have some intersections with the author of the Master and Margarita himself. We do not know if it was done deliberately or not. One Russian literary critic and one of the best researchers on Bulgakov's works claimed the master's figure is undisguisedly autobiographical. Bulgakov almost emphasizes that, and also claimed that the words, famous quote from this novel, "Manuscripts don't burn," are actually also autobiographical. We know that Bulgakov burned the first edition of Master and Margarita in 1930. A year earlier, the author was searched, and some of his literary works, along with his personal diary, were confiscated. Secondly, the writer had an excellent memory, which obviously helped him to rewrite the novel. He kept everything in his head. That's why if he burned his manuscripts, if he didn't burn them, it didn't matter. Everything was in his memory. What other things catch our eye? Well, those lines describing suffering and indignation of the master when he sees all those unfair reviews about him and his works in the newspapers are actually mirrored to the indignation and suffering of Bulgakov himself. Interestingly, the writer even had a whole handmade book with the surnames of his enemies, extracts with unflattering remarks or surnames of those who informed the authorities about him, and there were quite a few of them. In his letter to Stalin in 1929, the writer emphasizes, out of 301 reviews of his work, 298 were hostile and abusive. Unfair criticism came, firstly, because of Bulgakov's views on the events taking place in Russia, who became the most dangerous opponent for the government. The Soviet government, as one of the researchers of Bulgakov's work claimed, looked not at the writer's talent, but at his biography. This undoubtedly affected the author's nervous system. He, like the master, began to have panic attacks a few years before his death. He was afraid of the dark and even began to see something in the dark, so he slept with the lights on. In general, Bulgakov would then die because he would be overwhelmed by absolutely unfair prohibitions, refusals to be published, and complete disregard for the rest of his days. But until the end of his days, Bulgakov would write The Master and Margarita, which, as the writer's wife swore, would bring to its final form and would publish after his death. He was writing The Master and Margarita literally almost his last day. The author dies in 1940, and please note that even after his death, Bulgakov's literary works would remain prohibited. The final version of the novel would be published only after more than 20 years after his death in Paris, and it would take even more to come out in the USSR. And as some consider Bulgakov to be the prototype of the master, so they consider his wife Yelena Bulgakova to be the prototype of Margarita in the novel. According to preserved letters, Bulgakov sometimes even called her a witch. At their first meeting, she asked Bulgakov to tie some strings on her blouse, so he thought she tied him this way to herself forever, performed her magic on him. Well, according to the very description of the image of Margarita, it is impossible not to notice some similarities with Yelena Bulgakova. Margarita was married when she met and when she began her relationship with the master, just like Yelena Bulgakova met the author while being married to another man, and some aspects of appearance, especially the eyes, resemble to the description of Margarita too. We learn about Margarita in detail only in the second part of the novel. Here we see love described in all colors between the master and Margarita. We previously stopped at the fact that the master had been in the hospital for 4 months, thinking that his beloved had already forgotten him forever. Let's see how it really was. Follow me, reader. Who told you that there is no such thing as real, true, eternal love? Cut out his lying tongue. Follow me, reader, and only me, and I will show you that love. The master was wrong when he told Ivan with such bitterness in the hospital that hour before midnight that she had forgotten him. It was impossible. Of course, she had not forgotten him. To say more, Margarita has been going crazy for these 4 months, which lasted like an eternity for her, and now the day has come when her torments should have come to an end. Her prophetic dream said this, so she comes to the same place where she met the master exactly a year ago, in the Alexander Garden, near which, by the way, a farewell ceremony is taking place with Berlioz, whose head is stolen. Here Azazello sits down with Margarita. He knows about the master. That's all it takes to lure her. Smeared with Azazello cream, Margarita becomes a witch, and then the queen of the ball, which is held by Woland. Before we get to the ball, I think it's necessary to look at another important fact. Other prototypes of Margarita. In whom did Bulgakov find, borrow the traits of the master's beloved? First, let us turn again to Goethe's Faust, in which we see Gretchen. Secondly, there's also Margaret of Valois. Why this French queen? Well, let's pay attention now to these words that Koroviev says to Margarita.
Но ведь и вы сами королевской крови.
Почему королевской крови?
Ах, королева, вопросы крови – самые сложные вопросы в мире. Одна из французских королев, надо полагать, очень бы изумилась, если бы ей кто-нибудь сказал, что ее очаровательную пра-пра-пра-правнучку я по прошествии многих лет буду вести в Москве по бальным залам. Но мы пришли.
Of course, some claim that this is another illusion of Margaret of Valois, but others completely dismiss this possibility since the queen was childless. Therefore, they also cite other possible prototypes. A French princess, the sister of King Francis I, one of the first women writers in France, the Queen of Navarre, or Margaret of Angoulême. Undoubtedly, all literary researchers and critics have cited and continue to cite the most interesting facts and possible discoveries of the secrets of the Master and Margarita, but still, I personally would not try to look for completely accurate historical prototypes of any character of the novel. Each character, including Margarita, in my opinion again, could not be accurately and in detail copied from a historical or mythological person. Each character is ambivalent, just like the novel itself, where the literary space does not necessarily coincide with the real one. Well, let's go back to probably the central, one of them, parts of the novel, the Satan's Grand Ball, hosted by Woland in the very apartment number 50, whose walls expand to the desired size, or even better to say, where the very concept of size and measurement in general disappears. Margarita becomes the queen of the ball. She is wearing a medallion with the image of a poodle, the same poodle's head that was featured on Woland's walking stick. The poodle was historically associated with power and luxury. The black poodle is a symbol of demonic and otherworldly forces. By the way, in Goethe's Faust, we also see a poodle. Margarita then is washed in blood, such as symbolic baptism. She must meet guests. It is clear what kind of guests: murderers, criminals, magicians, alchemists, poisoners, etc. As many experts say, this is a turn-over novel. Everything is turned upside down here. Margarita is baptized in the contrary way. Instead of holy water, blood. Instead of white clothes, nakedness. Instead of a cross, a symbolic image of Satan. The medallion worn around her neck causes Margarita to feel an unusual heaviness. The chain immediately began to rub her neck. The image brought her to bend. If the Christian sacrament of baptism marks the rebirth to a new life in God, the sins are removed. But what happens to Margarita here is the opposite. Having been in the bloody font, she plunges into all the sins of the world. The guests of the ball are especially worth talking about, since they are historical figures who actually existed. There are many Frenchmen here. The French court of the 16th century, with its countless intrigues, poisonings, and love affairs, is interesting to look at. For example, Jacques Lecoeur, a French merchant, was accused of making counterfeit coins and poisoning the mistress of Charles VII. The presence of Mrs. Tofana also presents an interesting scene. This was the famous poisoner Teofania di Adamo, after whom this poison is named. It is noted that the killer confessed when she was tortured by the Spanish boot she was wearing at the ball. Nastasia Minkina is also present here. The mistress of Arakcheev, who was known for her cruelty towards peasants. For example, she was convicted of torturing her room girl, who was distinguished by unusual beauty. So on numerous occasions, Minkina tortured her and burned her face. Here we meet Emperor Rudolf II, who was more interested in science than politics, especially alchemy. There were astrologers and other scientists found at his court. Alchemy was strongly condemned by the church at that time. Caligula, Roman emperor known for debauchery. Malyutas Kuratov, Ivan the Terrible's confidant, and other personalities also take part in the ball and greet the queen in admiration. There are two other very important characters at the ball. The first of them is Baron Maigel, who works at Entertainment's Commission as a guide to the sites of the capital for foreign visitors. However, in fact, this Baron Maigel is a spy, an informer. He works with foreigners, collects all the necessary, all the interesting data, and then informs, well, let's call it certain departments. Because of this, he finds himself at Woland's ball, where eventually he is killed. That is exactly why many readers find another parallel, again, between Jerusalem and Moscow. Baron Maigel is mirrored to Judas. Both are traitors and both are killed for their betrayals. Judas betrays Yeshua Ha-Notsri and Baron Maigel betrays Woland. So then his blood is collected in a cup, which Berlioz's head has turned into. Woland drinks from this cup and then offers to Margarita to drink from it. This is actually how the scene of the ball ends, after which Woland is ready to make one and only one wish of Margarita come true, in honor of the fact that she has served him as his queen at the ball. However, she shows her pride and does not want to ask for anything, although of course she thinks about the master. You should never ask anyone for anything. Never, and especially from those who are more powerful than yourself. They will make the offer, and they will give of their own accord. Woland sums it up, praising Margarita for her pride. These very words, by the way, have become to some extent another catchphrase, popular phrase. Here the second character appears that needs to be looked at, Frida, an internally suffering woman who killed her baby, putting a handkerchief in his mouth. The handkerchief is now being given to her every now and then. Frida has sunk into Margarita's soul to such an extent that she decides to use her only wish for her. She is forgiven eventually. Frida is another example of a reference to Goethe's Faust. There Margaret killed her child. But there is one but. Woland did not do anything for her. What do you want for yourself? I want you to give me back instantly, this minute, my lover, the master, says Margarita. This is how the reunion of two lovers takes place. But let's not forget about the parallel scenes of the master's own novel. What is happening in Ershalaim? Yeshua Ha-Notsri is killed after all. His disciple, Levi Matvei, could not help him in any way. Judas, who betrayed Yeshua for 30 pieces of silver, is killed by Afranius, the head of the secret service of the procurator of Judea. Pontius Pilate offers Levi Matvei to work for him. He declines and fiercely responds, "Because you would be afraid of me. You would not find it very easy to look me in the face after having killed him That's basically how the master's novel ends. He burns it without finishing. But as Woland notes when talking with the Master and Margarita, the manuscripts don't burn, and Behemoth hands the whole manuscript of the novel to Woland, who is, without any doubt, already pretty much familiar with its content. You might not know it, but before the final version of the novel appeared, there were several more. As it is now presumed, there are 6 editions of the novel, the first one of which the writer began in around 1928, and that first edition was far from what we read now. There was no Master, no Margarita. The novel itself was going to be named as The Engineer's Hoof, or else The Hoof of a Consultant, Satan, the Black Magician. Among the family, the novel was usually called simply The Novel About Devil. Initially, everything was obvious to Bulgakov. The author of the novel about Pilate is Woland, but as the novel proceeded, the performer of the manuscript becomes a human, the master. Here, the master doesn't even have to sell his soul as Margarita did to Satan. He basically doesn't have a soul anymore. He's incapable of any action. Well, okay, the master replied, and laughing added, of course, when people are completely robbed, like you and me, they seek salvation from an otherworldly force. Well, I agree to look there. These are his last words. Meanwhile, everything related to passion, enthusiasm, confidence is on Margarita. It is sometimes argued that the devil needed the master's recognition of the devil's power, and he got it, he achieved it through a woman. We are approaching the end of the novel, and what do we say? Let everything be as it was, let us be together in our little basement. This is the only thing Margarita wants, the only thing she asks Woland. Does he make her only wish come true? Well, at first glance, yes, we see that the two lovers are together again, they are in the same place, and it seems like they die there together too. But it only seems. Woland is a liar, and it's no surprise about it. Note that everything he does in Moscow is turning basically into nothing at all. The money people get from his show turn into paper. The clothes gifted to women disappear at all. It's all an illusion, the same illusion that the master and Margarita die together. No, the master dies in the hospital and Margarita in her home. In one of the final chapters, we read that at sunset, high above the town, one of the stone roof of one of the most beautiful buildings in Moscow, built about a century and a half ago, Woland prepares to leave the city. There's no more time for him left here. The Sunday is approaching, Easter. He clearly can't be here. It's the moment when he is visited by Levi Matvey, another key moment of the novel, and asks Woland to take the master with him, granting him peace. He can't be taken to light, since he hasn't earned it. The last thing the master and his beloved Margarita do before going to peace is to visit his hospital fellow, Ivan Bezdomny, who is pronounced by the master to be his disciple. Doesn't it look like another parallel between the Moscow characters and the ones from Ershalaim? Very often, Levi Matvey is compared to Ivan Bezdomny, who, according to some literary critics, might even be the main character of Bulgakov's novel. Levi Matvey was the one who followed Yeshua. Ivan was the one who deep inside, as it turns out, still had some faith in God. Levi Matvey leaves everything and everyone and follows the path of Yeshua. Ivan lives his old life and his old occupation in poetry. He admits his poetry was stupid and promises to start a new life, so to speak. He should be the one who must finish the novel. And so, just before the Sunday comes, and with that Easter, Woland and his companions, along with the Master and Margarita, are hurrying to leave Moscow, the city that was considered to be the center of Orthodox Christianity, Moscow, the third Rome. That was the place where Woland, as he thought, was going, but came to the place of absolute and imposed atheism. As we have already mentioned, Woland, the perfect liar, is full of illusions, just like his entourage. They are taken off on the Sparrow Hills, set mounted on black horses, looking at the city spread out beyond the river with fragments of sun glittering from thousands of west-facing windows. Koroviev, Azazello, Behemoth finally show their true appearances. Far away from funny, witty, happy figures, they presented themselves in front of us at the beginning of the novel. The very last chapter of the Master and Margarita, where we can see the reunion, let's call it so, of Pontius Pilate, who is now proclaimed by the Master free, and Yeshua Ha-Notsri, who together live walking along the moonlight path. The scene is actually written brilliantly, and I really don't want to mess it up with my own comments. Read it by yourself and enjoy. The novel still arises an unprecedented number of questions to this day. Readers, interestingly, have opinions about the novel that differ to such an extent that sometimes it is even hard to imagine how one person came to such a conclusion and another one came up with a bunch of literally opposite explanations for the novel. Some readers see obvious connections to the Bible, meanwhile others keep to the opinion that the Master and Margarita was written about and for Stalin. However, the Master and Margarita, and I say it with certainty, believe me, in the school literature curriculum is one of the most, if not the most, readable work in Russia. There are people who do not read, who are not interested in literature, but if you ask that person, what book have you read that you really enjoyed, then I would say 85% of them will say it is this novel by Bulgakov, the meanings of which will probably never be unraveled. As the Russian literary critic Evgeny Zharinov once said, the Master and Margarita is easy to read, but it is not easy to understand. It can provoke thoughts related to concepts of human being, and it is then that you start writing your own novel. You yourself now are directly related to it.